Okay, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Public Arts Equity in Action. My name is Fernanda Sierra Suarez, the Community Engagement and Programs Manager at Culture Days National, and I use she, her pronouns. A few reminders on the Zoom webinar settings and access features before we jump into the presentations. You can personally turn on the option for closed captions below the screen. This will create auto-generated English captions. And the presenters will be also sharing a public view link and transcript of their presentations so you can follow along. A reminder that only the presenters' microphones and cameras will be on, but please use the chat to interact with us and with one another. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them directly into the Q&A box, which you can find below your screen to make sure that we don't miss the questions. And you can also upvote or comment on questions submitted by other attendees that you would like to be answered by the presenters, and we'll have time after the presentations to deep into these discussions. If you would like to ask a question through the microphone rather than by typing it, please raise your virtual hand and we'll be able to open the mic setting for you. And if we do not get to all of the questions, please connect with us at info@culturedays.ca or with any of the panelists as well. We'll be sharing the contacts via the chat. And today's session will be recorded and available with English and French captions if you wish to review it or share it with your colleagues and your network. So today I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of many nations, and that includes the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. The city now known as Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. These territories are guided by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Bell Covenant. And Toronto remains a home and meeting place for many Indigenous peoples whose presence and cultures continue to shape and influence our communities. Very grateful to be hosted on this land today. And this webinar is part of resources that we offer year-round and in preparation for the Cross Canada Culture Days celebrations in the fall. So Culture Days is a national celebration of arts and culture, this year running from September 20th to October 13th. And over this 3-week run, organizers, volunteers, artists, creators, and community members from all over Canada showcase the important role that arts and culture play in strengthening communities by hosting free public events. And we're very, very excited for today's session. We have been looking forward for a while. So today we welcome Shanice Bernicky and Annalissa Crisostomo, and we really hope that this program provides you with tools and knowledge on how to foster and put into practice and assess equity in your organizations and in your communities. That said, let me welcome the wonderful speakers today. Hello, Shanice. Hello, Annalissa. How are you doing?
Amazing. Thank you so much for having us. We're so pleased to be here.
Good as well. Thank you. I'm excited.
So I'll read your bios quickly. So Shanice Bernicky is a media maker and 4th-year PhD student at Carleton University School of Journalism and Communication. She completed a master's research creation thesis in media studies at Concordia University as a nonlinear documentary exploring themes of domestic violence, heritage, and multiracial identity from the access point of Black hair. At Carleton, Shanice researches equity practices in the settler Canadian public art institutions. And Annalissa is a creative educator, artist, and community facilitator with nearly a decade of experience in community education and engagement. She is passionate about the transformative power of the arts and creativity to ignite and foster leadership, healing, and social change. Annalissa is currently pursuing her PhD in adult education and community development at the University of Toronto, with a focus on creative and radical healing pedagogies within organizations and community learning spaces. Again, welcome Shanice and Annalissa, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and your tools with us today.
Thank you so much, Fernanda. I really appreciate that. So I'm just gonna get us started by sharing my screen. So just to make sure, I'm going to ask the other panelists and host if they can see my screen okay, just so we are good to go. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Annalissa. And so what you'll see here on the screen before we begin is actually a script of the presentation. So there's a QR code which you can use to access the full script. I find this to be really helpful. I know Annalissa finds this to be helpful. And also, because we don't have a lot of time today, there's quite a bit of information in there that you might want to look through. There's also some links. You know, please feel free to use it. And it should be popped into the chat as a link as well. Okay. Okay. So before I begin, for accessibility purposes, I am a female-coded, multiracial, Black-presenting person. I have medium brown skin, dark brown hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a purple cardigan and thick tortoiseshell glasses. My name is Shanice Bernicky. My pronouns are she, her, ed, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I also see that there are folks joining from across the country, so welcome. Thank you so much for your time. So I would like to acknowledge that the land on which I love, work, and play, and that Carleton University mobilizes, is the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have been the custodians of these lands and waters since time immemorial, and I don't ever forget this. I also want to acknowledge that the folks that have contributed to this research that we'll be talking about today live and work across Turtle Island, inhabiting traditional territories of the Inuit, Métis, and First Nation peoples. I do not give a land acknowledgement solely because it is common practice. In fact, I do recognize the hypocrisy that comes from institutions and those who are heavily supported by them, providing one when their institutions are so unwilling to provide reparations or enact change. But I give a land acknowledgement because it is from this colonial context, as well as the shared global historical lineage, that my research, regardless of the topic, stems. I want to thank Culture Days for their continued partnership with this research and for organizing this fantastic event today. And thank you, Annalissa, for a contribution to this ever-expanding framework and research project. I also want to thank all of you for being here today, because I know that time is precious, so thank you. So for today's short presentation segment of the webinar, we will first begin by giving a short writing exercise that we'll do to welcome folks into the space. And there's kind of a list here. So second, I'll start off by providing an overview of the project and the framework and how it came to be from my own perspective. Third, I'll delve into the process that influenced the construction of the impact assessment framework in question, so the spiraling outward for equity. Fourth, I will provide a glimpse into the framework 6 months into its release and how it's currently being used and some of the impact. Then fifth, Annalissa will be providing some of her own experience with the research process. She'll then delve into adaptable examples for application of equitable practices. And seventh, she will also provide a summary of public arts equity in practice. And then finally, we'll end our presentation segment with another writing exercise before we dive into discussion portion of the webinar, which we're so excited for. But as you can see, there's quite a bit on the agenda today, so we do hope that it won't be too overwhelming. And if it is, please feel free to take a step back and take the time that you need. So we're going to start us off with a short reflexive writing exercise, and it doesn't necessarily have to be writing. It could be reflecting, it could be whatever you want to be, because you are not going to be sharing this, so don't worry. So take a moment, 2 minutes, to ponder the question. In your professional role, what does assessment mean for you? So right now it's currently 2:11, so take about until 2:13. All right, thank you so much for humoring us by starting off with that writing exercise. And I do hope that, maybe after the session, you take a few notes of the things that you reflected on at the beginning, and then we will be doing this exercise again before the Q&A. So how did this project come to be? I'm lucky enough to be one of 5 resident researchers for Mass Culture, an arts support organization. And since I see a lot of you are coming from, especially across Ontario, I'm sure that you've probably come into running with Mass Culture at one point or another. But anyways, as one of the 5 resident researchers, for this My Tax funded project, us researchers have the ability to pitch our own projects. So for instance, Emma Bugg, who is currently on the screen as well, out of Dalhousie University, was considering arts and climate change. And so in the script, there's also a link to the framework that Emma developed along with some collaborators. There's also Sydney Pickering from Emily Carr that worked on Indigenous knowledge practices and our policy. And then there's also Erin Richmond from McGill University that considered accessibility in performing arts. And me, well, my personal and professional life has followed a trend of deep thought as it relates to equity in fraught but hopeful contexts. Thus, my current research stems from a place of lived experience and academic curiosity. From what I've researched, and I think research is a very flexible term. Research can be, my head and nose in the books. It could also mean walking and living life as a person who I am with my varying intersections. It can also be having conversations with folks. But anyways, what I researched is that equity in a lot of the plans that I was seeing coming from 2020 on, equity was an afterthought in many of those. So they were considering diversity and inclusion, which are very highly contested terms, and they're also very fluid terms, which I'm sure we can talk about in the Q&A, but they weren't considering what equity means. So it seemed that a lot of the plans were thinking about, well, if we had a more diverse staff, so also a contentious term, that would lead into more equity, which is not necessarily always the case. So instead, my project, Spiraling Outward for Equity in Public Arts, challenges this trend, searching for a way forward by harnessing the artistic license of the arts and culture sector. And the process is twofold. First, developing equity and inclusivity indicators and an impact framework for the cultural sector. And second, developing a framework with impact indicators within a virtual makerspace setting. So these two things are quite similar, but my research questions were the following, and they're also on screen. How can access to the arts and culture sector from coast to coast to coast be more equitable? And how can participatory methods be used to engage more community members in the move towards more equitable cultural spaces? And so this framework that we're discussing today and that you have access to publicly online only really scratches the surface of the questions above. I will most likely continue my dissertation work and beyond responding to them. But this project brought together members, specifically in the space I'll be talking about in a couple of minutes. So it brought together members, and this list is definitely not exhaustive, but artists and cultural workers who publicly identified as Indigenous, persons of color, Black, persons with disabilities, hidden or not, or a member of an LGBTQ2 plus community. And so we kind of got together in a space and we asked a question about what equity was and what did it mean in the cultural sector. But more than anything, the project hopes, and it will continue to hope, to foster an inclusive space and bring together peer people. But as part of my residency with Mass Culture, producing this civic impact framework was quite bizarre when we consider what equity is and how it flows and is shaped by the different spaces in which people move through. But one of the things that I will say that I was incredibly privileged to have is not only being part of this project, but also that I was paired with Culture Days actually to conduct this work. And through conversations with the National Culture Days team, I was able to send out a call coast to coast to coast to have folks as part of those identifying or equity seeking groups to, ponder those questions along with me. But one of the things that I appreciated was that because of this conversation and the constant work, my work doesn't exist in a silo. There were 3 stages of the Research in Residence project, or the R&R project. So the first was surveying the literature surrounding the topic of social inclusion in the arts. The second was conducting fieldwork to inform the construction of the civic impact framework. And then the third was to construct the framework. But going beyond all these requirements, it is a continual collection of feedback from collaborators and the adapting the framework as new circumstances arises. So that adapting of the framework is something that I'm currently contending with now as it has currently been released. So as the Research and Resident Project officially concluded last summer, with the release of the 3 frameworks, we residents are now paired with organizations to test their use and how they can be adapted to unique community needs. So for one, I'm lucky enough that I'm working with PMB, which I can talk a little bit more later, and then also PAPSO Public Arts program in Ottawa. So thinking specifically of 2 distinct organizations or government arms and how to adapt the framework for their own needs in their communities. But what actually influenced the framework that you have access to was something called a makerspace gathering. So makerspace gatherings are, it's kind of something that I developed that is an adaptation of like the walking interview. And a walking interview is typically where the interviewee and interviewer go walking through a certain space. And the interviewee, as a result of the tones, the sounds, the textures, the air, and the location, all of that informs the responses to the question. But because this was the pandemic and folks were joining from coast to coast to coast, this was online. And so a makerspace gathering is kind of an adaptation because what we were doing instead was asking creative questions and making together while talking specifically about equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I asked questions like, and this is something I think that folks can replicate, especially in organizations when they're bringing folks in for town halls or community, just like think groups or consultation. So it's instead of doing things like just asking the question blank, I would ask, what color, texture, tone comes to mind when you think of equity, diversity, and inclusion? And surprisingly, just those questions spiraled into a whole animated discussion of the realities of the public arts organizations. And some of them were, 1, lack of stable funding, 2, few staff members that can be allocated to doing equity-centered work, 3, municipal and federal barriers to continue to fully accessible spaces, 4, tokenizing of equity-seeking staff and community members, which leads to harmful results such as burnout. But by asking those questions, it does something else besides just kind of like prompting reflection. It also attempts to overcome painful memories. So the use of Miro or even the Zoom chat for where I asked the questions, folks were able to go through Creative Commons sites to look for like textures and also look for sounds. So these were tangible artistic linkages to the subject, but they also provided a soothing atmosphere. And this helped collaborators and me as well to focus on something seemingly silly in contrast to a painful and possibly trauma-invoking topic. And third, by doing this, we were engaging in laughter and communal care by creating together in world building. So in sharing back our selected images, shapes, colors, and sounds, there was a lot of laughter. The texture and sound props especially spiraled out into a discussion of what our world might look like if we engaged in respectful and caring exploration, as well as committing to building a bank of shared resources. And so that whole collection of conversations, we had 2 makerspace gatherings, and I've also done this in larger settings, so at a conference, and instead of using Miro and Zoom, we actually used Play-Doh. And as someone who's pretty nervous, I always have a little bit of Play-Doh with me. I don't know what this is, but it's fine. And that was also, so make a shape or texture, and you can also use Lego. So what it does is kind of like animates the discussion. But in a similar spirit, because we don't have much time today to get to know all of you viewers, we actually built a Padlet for you, for those who have joined the webinar, to share resources with each other. So kind of in the same spirit of sharing together. So please do note that these resources will be publicly available over the internet, and the link will remain open following the session. So please contribute any resources you think fellow attendees might appreciate in relation to the topic of today's presentation. We can also go back to the Padlet a little bit later in the discussion. So I do want to mention a couple things before I wrap up. This project began at the height of COVID-19 pandemic. So the fatigue, isolation, resource scarcity, and fear was quite palpable. So there were a lot of different things that folks, especially in organizations, were contending with. And what came out was a framework that is also an archive of a small snapshot of what the Canadian arts and culture sector was grappling with at the time. And now that we're at the tail end of the pandemic, living through a climate crisis, a housing crisis, and the cutting of public funds, which we see on the daily, the reason for why the construction of the civic impact framework is a spiral, enveloped by the earth and watched over by the sun, acknowledges the timeless approach of equity work that is needed. So seeing this type of work as a process ensures we continue to build, adapt, shift, review over and over again. And so that's part of assessment, right? And so I have a last slide before I pass it off to Annalissa, which I recommend taking a photo of because I won't cover all of the items, but there's a reason for why the indicators in the framework that you have access to is written a little differently than most things. And the most notable difference between this framework and the EDI plans is that there's no numerical goals, and it requires a mix of quantitative, so a lot more quantitative in the sense of like data, that's numbers, and qualitative, which might be stories, methods of analysis for full assessment. So unfortunately, we understand that the realities of needing concrete numerical data to receive funding. However, we need to begin to band together to push the importance of qualitative data. Adopting a human-centered approach to civic impact is less deflating and encourages continual commitment. So thinking about that and thinking about how can we use together quantitative, but then also qualitative to push forward the stories that need to be told and to fight for the resources that we need, which does require banding together from coast to coast to coast with as many organizations as possible so this can be something that's done. So thank you so much for listening to my portion. It was quite fast, but I'm so happy to talk about any of the questions or things you'd like me to expand on. But I'll now pass it off to Annalissa, who was a collaborator on the framework and as a community consultant has ample experience doing equity-centered work.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Shanice. So to reintroduce myself, hi, everyone. My name is Annalissa. I use she, her pronouns. As mentioned, I had the privilege of working with Shanice on this research project as a participant and collaborator to support the development of this framework. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own experience working with Shanice and highlight some of the aspects of that research process and how it also reflects a community approach to arts-based equitable practice. So afterwards, I'll actually go through some adaptable examples of how I've applied some equitable practices in my own work as a community practitioner. And I just want to note here that I use arts-based kind of in parentheses because, although not every practice we mention in this webinar is arts-based per se, I do want to emphasize the opportunities that you all have as community arts practitioners and artists to really leverage your creative strengths and bring them into this work. So some key things I've highlighted here on the screen about the research process with Shanice. So the first was this principle of trust building and role modeling vulnerability, right? So it's important to remember that trust is earned. It's not given freely. And so actually investing time to earn that trust and try to bring that into the space is important. And so, for example, as Shanice kind of indicated, there was time that was allocated to icebreakers as a practice of trust building, but also Shanice role modeled vulnerability herself, right? So a great rule of thumb for myself is that I never make people do something that I would never do myself. And so actually having Shanice a part of that process, answering the questions with us and really co-exploring was really one of those things that helped us feel a little bit more comfortable in that space and realize that she was really a co-conspirator or an ally with us in trying to figure out how to solve some of these issues and barriers. The second is that she really took a participatory approach, right? So, she compensated us for our time and for sharing our experiences and expertise. And she really treated us as participants and collaborators as full and equal collaborators in this process. So in many ways, what she did with that is challenged the dominant perspectives about who is considered an expert and what is considered valid knowledge, right? So she invited our personal selves into this space and really valued what we brought into this space as well. And then, lastly, there was a very wide range of folks that were invited into this space. And so being able to engage with a diverse group of community arts practitioners also made the experience meaningful for us as we continue to be able to develop our own understandings of equity work and assessment within that. Third is multiple meanings and naming our own reality. So she gave a lot of different opportunities for us to do this, right? So art and creativity really provide a special, unique opportunity for multiple meanings and interpretations to be invited into this space. And by inviting that kind of engagement through creative prompts and exercises, as mentioned, it really ignites critical thinking and stimulates dialogue in really unexpected ways. And then lastly, when you provide alternative ways to respond to questions and express yourself, you really honor the choice of disclosure, especially for folks that are coming from equity deserving groups or that may have vulnerable or traumatic experiences. So being able to choose how we wish to engage and being able to still engage rather than having to pass was something that was really part of that ultimately building trust process. And then lastly, this idea of community feedback loops, right? So continuously coming back to the community is something that's really important, and she's embedded that even in the research process. So opportunities for us to give her feedback about that process, to review the work, to provide revisions or clarify some of our own quotes in our own work, and even confirming whether this really does represent the conversations that we had together. And so in many ways, what she did was she was, reducing as much bias as possible, although that's something that cannot be like completely eliminated. Next slide, please. So there are many ways that you can adopt and embed these practices into your own work. So Shanice has laid some really great pathways and questions and resources within the framework and toolkit, which I believe Alyssa has shared within the chat. But here are some examples of applications I've used in my own work that can support you with both kind of formative and summative assessment. So summative assessment is really assessment that's done at the end of something. So that's at the end of a workshop, at the end of a program, at the end of perhaps even a long strategic plan. And then a formative assessment is really assessment that is done kind of like along the way. It occurs throughout the process of the workshop or the program or the strategic plan, and it works as kind of like a pulse check. So some standard tools for assessment really include surveys and interviews and focus groups. Other examples include hosting community town halls and people's assemblies where people can talk about, topics at hand, or even bring to the actual space topics that they're interested in discussing. So in all of these cases, you're able to gain both quantitative and qualitative responses. However, as mentioned before, I really just wanted to highlight how creative prompts and exercises provide you with the opportunity to gain feedback and insights and ideas about the experiences of community members to capture like both the effective and effective aspects of programming. So I'll give a couple examples. I won't go through maybe all of them. If you have any questions, please feel free. So similar to Shanice, I've used color as an entry point to understanding experience. So what colors represent your experiences throughout the program, and created a mood board. Another is a check-in question that I do at the top of all of my classes, as well as in my meetings as a supervisor, which is, what's your weather like in your world today? And so these are great entry points in understanding a temperature check of how folks are feeling, and being able to kind of respond appropriately to that without giving folks or putting pressure on folks to disclose anything personal. Now, surprisingly, when you hear people say, oh, it's a tornado outside, or it's raining, or there's, sun at the end of the tunnel, a lot of the times this is part of that trust building. And so what happens is that people actually end up disclosing or talking to me about what is going on in their lives, the barriers that they're experiencing. And this can actually inform me about any systemic changes with the power that I have needed to address any barriers or to bring it forward to other staff. And so another is a wonder wall. So some folks might have seen this. So this is just places for people to leave questions, comments, suggestions, or any questions about the department processes, for example. And then lastly, one of my favorite ones so far has been during my time facilitating for TAPA's Town Hall, which is the Toronto Performing Arts Association, as part of CIC. So I led a Dragon's Den activity, which was modeled after the TV show. So community members formed groups to review all of TAPA's programs, and then they selected 1 to 2 programs to pitch as priority programs for TAPA to quote unquote kind of invest in. So these programs were chosen for a range of reasons, including, participants thought they addressed barriers to participation, or that they better served TAPA community's specific needs. And then through this exercise, participants actually reimagined what these programs might look like if there were more resources invested in them. And so because they were a performing arts group, we had quite a few members who actually also took advantage of this space to actually perform and demonstrate some of their chosen program pitches with scripts that allowed them to really show what these actual issues are and how they would address them with the program. So I have some additional adaptable examples. And so I've had a range of experiences, part of equity work within organizations, whether that be as part of like an equity-based committee or as a researcher to assess equity in student development programs, or even just as a program lead in leadership. And a lot of times this work falls on people from equity deserving groups and communities. And this has always led me to come back to the question, what does it mean for us to really honor and acknowledge the time, the knowledge, and the energy that's done within this work? And so I wanted to give some examples of how that can be done, or how I've seen it be done. And so one is formal recognition and naming your lineages. So, including names in reports, for example. And this is also something that you want to ask for consent, right? Not everybody wants their name on reports like this. And so this is part of that ongoing consent. Second is kind of monetary compensation where possible. So we do want to recognize kind of the limitations and precariousness of community arts work and community arts funding. And additional funding might be really difficult, and it's not always possible. But I've seen this actually negotiated in different ways to recognize really the emotional labor and often the additional labor that's involved in this work. So I've seen this in terms of like paid days off or leaving work early every Friday. Yeah, just to name a few. The third is investing in opportunities for personal and professional growth. So thinking about how you can really leverage your own knowledge, your power, and positions to support the personal and professional growth of individuals according to what they identify as meaningful. So don't make any assumptions about that. It's probably good to actually ask them what might be a meaningful exchange for them. So some examples could be providing mentorship to support them in actually moving up in positions in your organization, actually taking time to nominate them for awards or formal recognition, and developing and creating personalized reference letters. And I mean this in versus kind of generic certificates or reference letters that are kind of printed in last numbers, really taking that time and effort and putting that in to recognize your staff. And then lastly, advocating with and or on behalf of peers, participants, and community members doing the work, especially if they are from equity deserving groups. So, leveraging your power and position isn't just an interpersonal thing. It's something that really needs to happen on a systemic level as well. And so advocating and negotiating for compensation for equity work, or being persistent in the pursuit for actionable change, even when there's resistance or when it's something that could be maybe a little hard or uncomfortable for you. So I'm just going to go over a quick little summary, I think, because I talked a little bit about some examples, but here's kind of some of the principles that I've been able to identify that were overlaps between some of my own practices and Shanice's. So first is really honoring the experiences and emotions of individuals as sources of knowledge and ways of knowing, right? So we live in a world that really prioritizes quantitative data, objective facts, and like considers these as only valid, the only kind of valid sources of knowledge. So remembering that there's like somatic literacy, emotional intelligence, these are all really things that you can bring into the space that again really challenge what it means to be an expert and what it means to know something. Second is being grounded and continuously connected to what is happening on the ground. So often leaders, especially those in like managerial positions, are disconnected from the work that people are actually doing. And so, they start to delegate certain tasks. They start to give like unrealistic deadlines and deliverables. And so making sure that you're embedding some of these processes to make sure that you're consistently connected with all of the folks in your community and those that are working and doing this work on the ground. Third is being brave enough to be uncomfortable. So asking the hard questions, being accountable, and really mastering the apology when called in or called out. So, just noting that learning does not happen in the comfort zone. It really happens in the stretch zone. And oftentimes this could be really uncomfortable and familiar, but this is really where equity work lives. And so be okay with being uncomfortable, with normalizing humanness and normalizing making mistakes. It's actually inevitable. We've all done it. And just really, really practicing what accountability looks like, and practicing even the apology, even if it's like on your own in front of a mirror, for example. And then lastly, as emphasized by Shanice, but we can't say this enough, is really exercising and inviting creativity and play into the space, right? So oftentimes people look at equity equity work and social justice work is like purely burdensome or heavy or serious. And of course, it can be all of those things, but equity work can also be really fun. And once you invite fun into this space, you provide a sense of a space that opens up healing, but also provides kind of creative thinking to invite more unique responses that, you know, maybe a regular question in an interview might not. So mouthful. And so let's take a little bit of a pause here. So I know some folks might be antsy as they've been sitting down for a while. So we're going to take about a 2-minute break for those that need it. If you prefer, you can go ahead and do that. But we would like to, in the spirit of the spiral or the loop, invite folks to kind of revisit the question and the responses from the first exercise. And so the question here is, after these short presentations, has the meaning of assessment changed for you? And then if so, whether it's a yes or a no, explain why or how, or however way you want to kind of explore that question. And you can also maybe draw it if that's something that you'd like to do, but whatever you'd like. So we will take about 2 minutes and we'll come back at 2:40 to continue with our Q&A.
Thank you so much, Annalissa, for your fantastic portion of the presentation. I really appreciate all those concrete examples of things that can be done. And now we're off into the discussion and Q&A. And I'm just gonna read them out. And there's one for both of us, Annalissa. So I'll just start off with the first, which is, just a reminder that groups in rural and small communities are run by volunteers. And I think that's such an important thing to bring up, especially since that is the case for a lot of micro-organizations. It's also a lot of the case for grassroots organizations that have been doing equity work for a long time, that it is run by passionate folks, arts and culture sector, any other sector, who continue to do the work regardless of whether or not they receive any sort of monetary funds. But in those cases, what's great is the recognition and naming, and then also kind of the celebration of the folks who are doing that hard work. And then if there's anything that you can give that it like might be not of monetary value, but anything else, it might be like internships that have course credit. Let's say if they're at a small college or university and they're doing a course that might require an internship, that's something we can do. There are a few ways of working around the inability to provide monetary. There's so many different types of other compensation that might be negotiated with volunteers. And sometimes volunteers, like, because they volunteer, are just passionate about doing the work. But I think in that case, recognition is a fantastic start. And so that's the first response I have. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Annalissa?
No, I think that that's like a good point, right? And I think it goes back to, you know, what we talked about like what is actually meaningful for those volunteers. Even in my own experience working in higher education, a lot of folks, you know, they're either like low paid students that are not being properly compensated, to be honest, or volunteers. And so having those conversations, what is meaningful for you? What do you want to get out of this experience? What can be helpful? And then really thinking about how you yourself can really put yourself in the time and effort into trying to meet some of those needs and desires.
Thank you so much, Annalissa. And so we have another question. Do either of you have any advice for an organization that might have more standardized policy approach to EDI? So example, not very actionable, but has the right words, close bracket, and helping incoming/new leaders feel confident and organized in turning these good intentions into new ways of working. I think that's a fantastic question, whoever you are, and I appreciate that you brought that. I think that's a question that we will probably all be pondering for a while. But what I can say is that it always starts with going back to the team, right? Especially if you're a new leader or incoming, it's important to have that meeting with your team. And I don't know what kind of an organization this is, but to sit down. And one of the practices that I like to recommend is to sit down and ask them, like, generally speaking, to see how folks are, because no one's ever on the same page of like, what does equity work mean to them? And what are their understandings of equity, diversity, and inclusion? Because a lot of the time, the folks who then disperse to do those work, if no one is on the same page or doesn't have negotiate understandings that they work together, then a lot of the time you see that fall through the cracks, and you see that in the policies, right? You see it become more boilerplate and more generic. But if folks have a passion based on conversations as small teams, that kind of invigorates the process. The other thing is that when you have like standardized policies, those can be really deflating, because they'll be, especially in like some that we've seen, that by 5 years, we're going to have like all of these new diversity hires, we're going to have all of these things. So when you have those unattainable goals, they're exactly that, they're unattainable. And so what then happens is that you continue to push the boundaries, and so it's not actually actionable anymore. But if you sit down with team members and say, okay, well, what kind of resources do we have? What resources do we actually currently have access to that we can start to use? Have we already done town halls? Can we go back and like dig through those? Do we have liaisons that we can harness? So thinking about all the previous things that you had while coming into the team as a new leader, but then also trying to get everyone on the same page. And if not on the same page, because that's completely fine, but at least working together towards common goals. And common goals can be very incremental. It can start off by having anonymous survey feedback forms from your community members and also staff. It could be having like compensated town halls. It could be doing all these things. However, I usually suggest that whenever you're starting new and then there's like standardized, start within the team, because moving into community with such haste can be quite harmful actually, and it causes less trust for very obvious reasons. So that's some of my advice. How about you, Annalissa?
Yeah, thank you, Shanice. I definitely agree with you on some of the things that you can really put in place or start to kind of bring into the space to start stimulating conversations, including questions as such as, what does equity work to us within this organization? I think there's also like the capacity to leverage some of the statements that are used within that, right? So, we follow XYZ values. However, these are the kinds of things that aren't really happening. But I do want to also recognize that people have different levels of power to be able to feel comfortable kind of doing that and kind of pressing an organization or leaders to do that. And so I think the next part is really about embedding those accountability measures, right? And this is where your assessment from the community are going into building trust with the community and actually getting some of that insight from the community becomes really important, because what you get to do now is kind of leverage the feedback that's provided from folks about what they need, and even the suggestions that they have about what should be done, to kind of say, this is the community, this is what they're requesting. And the reason I say that is that, oftentimes, whether you're an organization that has membership in which people have buy-in, that accountability becomes really important, because now you should be meeting those needs, or you might lose membership. Or even when you think about communities, where you need to be accountable to the folks that you're serving. In many ways, there's, funding that becomes perhaps at risk if you're not actually like reaching some of these measures, or you're not actually showing how you're moving towards particular goals. And then I think there's another level that Shanice kind of talked about around transparency, right? And so this is when you start to see more organizations actually like publish strategic plans and reports about their updates versus just like only providing them to funders. And so having some processes that are transparent. Also, even if people are not necessarily like moving towards those things out of like the good heart that they have, accountability is a pretty strong thing to kind of move people to act and respond to their communities and their staff. So hopefully that's helpful.
We actually have, thank you so much, Annalissa. Those are fantastic, concrete examples and also suggestions. So we have quite a few questions to go through, and I hope we can. So we have one from Emily that says, oh, wait, one of them disappeared. I'm just going to go back. It kind of disappeared, but I remember the gist of it. So thinking specifically about access to funds, since there seems to be a large concentration, especially here in I'd say especially Ontario. So a lot of access seems to be available in the East and very little in the West. How can we get access to these funds? I think that is a very large question, especially considering that. But what I can say is that having worked and had conversations with folks in the Yukon, but then also folks in Moncton in New Brunswick, what I can say is that that disparity does exist in places that are not highly concentrated, especially large cities. And there are ample reasons for why this might be the case. That doesn't exclude why they should be the case, right? And so I don't have much of an answer of how to access funds, just the fact that there's a constant push towards that, especially my own research is seeing those disparities and those discrepancies, especially since we have large amounts of population that don't live on that southern border. So how do we actually disperse resources and funds, especially since the government is accountable to serving communities. So I'm thinking about this a lot and having conversations, and this is something that I think it comes down to, especially the sharing of resources. So in the framework, there's one part where we especially talk about the fact that there are some organizations that have not unlimited, but a pretty wealthy access to funds. But then how can they support other micro organizations by having pilot programs or other things where they can disperse resources to other micro organizations? And that doesn't necessarily need to be local organizations, because it becomes then a sharing of resources outward. But I really appreciate your question, and I know that I don't have an adequate answer, but definitely always thinking about that and some strategies for it. And Lisa, do you have anything? I don't.
Yeah, I would say similarly, I have limited knowledge around that, and so I would just kind of mirror what Shanice is saying in terms of there are resources and research projects around this exact issue and how people have been able to kind of advocate while also leveraging research projects, right? So if anyone in the webinar actually has, this kind of experience or knowledge or any kind of resources to share, please feel free. But I also have kind of limited knowledge in that.
Thanks, Annalissa. Yeah, I think the sharing of resources is especially a great way to start, right? So I think that building a community of practice, but then also sharing is really essential here. Okay, yes. Thank you, Fernanda. So what has been one of your favorite moments or discoveries while you were developing this framework / doing this work? Oh gosh, there are so many. And I think that Annalissa, maybe for you as well. I don't know, maybe you start off and then I'll think.
Yeah, I think, the actual gatherings itself with Shanice was really great for me in terms of this framework, but I think more generally in terms of my career has really been able to work with people directly. I mean, we get to do some of this stuff on the back end, and oftentimes we're kind of stuck behind a computer. And so I think there's just a lot of times when you get together with like-hearted folks or maybe not even always like-minded, there's a real, I think, sense of camaraderie. But, I've seen a lot of folks really come into their own empowerment, feel like they can actually take action. And also, I think in many ways it is really healing for folks, especially when folks that come together and have experienced so many barriers get to talk about their experiences, feel seen, actually feel like there's a space to talk about that, which is often not invited into other kind of workplaces or even sometimes communities. And so, yeah, I would say those aspects for me. What about you, Shanice?
Thanks, Annalisa. Yeah, I think the makerspace gatherings were really special. And I think one of the things about them that I loved was specifically the fact that there was a blurring between researcher and then also collaborators. And that's why there was the use of collaborators rather than participants or anything like that. Because as Annalisa, I love the way you put it, co-conspirators. And that was something that was so healing. The other thing that I think part of the research was just literally talking to people constantly and making all these connections, especially since it's really hard for equity seeking folks, depending on like if they don't have any background or links with the arts and culture sector, it's really hard to get in. And we can talk specifically about a lot of those barriers just at the get-go. And as someone who, you know, didn't really have access to all of these spaces, getting access to them and being able to speak to folks and to hear how dedicated they are to equity work, especially a lot of micro organizations who just literally don't have the resources, but they're so dedicated and are always trying to find like loopholes or clever ways around to kind of loop in their funding, especially like when they're writing grant applications, who kind of try to embed like some of the equity work that they're hoping to do alongside larger funding grants. Just, I think that is a fascinating discovery. And this is something that I'm sure has been done for decades, but I just thought that it was an interesting thing to hear from multiple like directors from organizations who are like, oh, I had to kind of like sneakily put this in here. And if we got the funding, then we can actually go forward and do that work. So thinking specifically about funding and how it was dispersed was a really interesting discovery, alongside just like the fun of the makerspace gatherings. Okay. All right. Do you want to pick any, Annalissa, and then we'll just go?
Yeah. Maybe I'll put them two together because I see someone has piggybacked. So one from an anonymous attendee. So we are a small organization with pretty limited resources that delivers programming directly to a very diverse community, but have a mandate of programming for quote unquote everyone. Any advice on this balancing quote unquote for everyone, but also wanting to be impactful in meeting community needs? In addition, second part by Kayla, how do BIPOC employees, how can they approach a majority white organization about the need to activate their EDI plan without taking on the labor ourselves? It's tough when they already think they're doing good work, but it's stagnant. Do you want to jump in, Shanice?
Yeah, I think there's a lot here, and I think one of these things could be a whole other webinar in itself, specifically because then it becomes like who is being catered to whom, what are we trying to talk about? And in this case, like specific, I'm going to read the question again because I have to for myself, but the question of making program for everyone is kind of one of the things I think we have in all sectors, in the education sector as well, of like lesson plans and like this would benefit X students only. But in the case of equity work, it actually benefits everyone. And there's no harm in being explicit about who you're hoping to serve with these particular types of programming, especially since like it's not exclusionary. It's just making up for the fact that a lot of the time folks in this case were just actively excluded. And so having resources for folks, especially of equity seeking groups, is not something that I would say that you can't do. And I actually think it's important to celebrate that. And there's also a part in the framework that does say to have spaces for folks of equity seeking, or diverse mind bodies is what I use, that are without microaggression, that are spaces that feel safer. And I think that it's important to have those. And I know that sometimes there will be pushback, but it's unfortunate that that's the case. However, it's not that just because they can't, it's not necessarily developed for them, doesn't mean that they don't have access to it. And so it's kind of one of those push and pull questions, but I think that it's okay to embrace the fact that the work that you're doing and for who you're doing it. And especially when you have limited resources, and there's not many organizations who are doing this work, I think you are probably quite supported by your community, especially since you're serving that community and those are the needs that you're addressing. So you can also back that up with metrics if you needed to, but then that becomes a question of like online surveys and things like that, and having folks do it so that you do feel comfortable having some sort of proof if the time comes. And for the second, for Kayla, that one is really difficult, and same thing of sectors. And we do know that folks do get pretty burnt out when they're asked to do the work, especially BIPOC folks. And they oftentimes are the ones who do the work for free. And they're often the ones who are expected to do the work or are always considered experts, even though they might not feel comfortable to do that work. But this is where it becomes really important to have, especially like white employees to actually use their privilege to voice opinions of saying, hey, this has been really stagnant, and we do have employees that we want to make sure that they feel that there's an equitable access in the space. And so kind of leveraging that privilege is kind of important in this case, because a workplace that is equitable for everyone is what we're looking for here. And it is unfortunate that a lot of the time BIPOC employees are the ones that typically have to go forward and push for these things. But if you can lean on, a white coworker, then it is something that I recommend. And I'm sure there's other ways. I don't know, Annalissa, do you have any suggestions for those?
Yeah, so I'll try to like not repeat some of the things that you said, because I definitely agree with them. So, addressing the first question about having limited resources and kind of having to create programming for everyone. One, just like remembering that like having affinity groups or affinity programming is not necessarily like a form of exclusion. Exclusion can actually be inclusion in this way. And so again, really advocating for some of that programming. But I think I've also seen kind of like mixed programming before, right? In which you're not actually saying like only these folks can join the space, but you can have very explicitly, we encourage these types of community members to join, or you can have, different kind of addressing different barriers, so different kind of sliding scale or different kind of options for tickets to join. But I've also seen some where, folks are very explicit about we are centering the experiences of racialized and equity deserving groups. And they've actually prioritized questions from these groups and these communities, so as to invite folks that are outside of these groups to actually like kind of sit back and listen to and learn from the folks in the space that are usually not being able to take up space there. So I think there's opportunity for you to kind of have mixed programming without necessarily having to be completely exclusionary, but still promoting and centering the voices of those that need it. And then as for the second part, I think that that's also just another really difficult question. I've been there myself in terms of being the only like racialized person in a group, addressing certain EDI strategies and goals that were not necessarily being met with resistance. And I will say, even having the experience of like leaning on a white colleague and not actually being supported at the time in which it was actually needed, even when it was requested, when I knew there was going to be pushback, right? And so when it comes to some of these things, I think everything that Shanice says is very valid. And I think it just kind of comes back down to how you're feeling in your body, how comfortable you feel with doing this work, whether this work is worth it for you to take on and put that effort into. I know that oftentimes we really want to see the change, and it's so important for us to do that. But just always remembering that it doesn't have to like land on you, and sometimes it might not actually be worth it for you to exert that much labor and energy, including like emotional labor and resistance. And so I know that might not necessarily be helpful, but I just want to contextualize that sometimes it's really not so black and white. And I think it comes back to coming back to who you are and how you feel you can be in that space.
Amazing. Thank you both so much for answering the questions and also for sharing so much knowledge and tools around equity. We will leave the Zoom platform open for a few minutes for anyone that has any questions. I would like to keep asking them. But again, if we don't get to your questions, feel free to connect with us via email. And we also send through the chat the contact information for Shanice and Annalissa if you wish to connect with them. Again, thank you both very much for joining us today. And don't forget that the best way to stay in the loop with Culture Day's news and future webinars and learning opportunities is through our newsletter. And you can sign up to our newsletter. You can sign up if you go to culturedays.ca/newsletter. It's also in the chat available. And speaking of future webinars, we will have another webinar March 21st, 2 p.m. as well here. And we'll be hosting a Culture Days one-on-one information session. This will be a session to learn more about what Culture Days is, how you can get involved. We'll be sharing fresh stats, resources to help you engage with your community through Culture Days and take part of this national celebration. And you can register via the chat. And also a reminder that the recording of this webinar, as well as a written overview, will be available in the coming weeks. And as Annalisa and Shanice shared, the Padlet and the presentation and the resources are available for you all to also access anytime. and we'll be sending that as well in their follow-up emails. And yeah, thank you once again to Shanice and Annalissa and for everyone that joined us today and was part of this conversation. And hope you have a great rest of your week. And again, we'll leave this open for a few minutes in case anyone else wants to stay and ask a couple more questions.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having us today.
Thank you so much. This was fantastic. I really appreciate all the discussion questions as well. So thank you. Excited to read the script slow-mo. I feel that. Thank you, Kayla.
Yes, we can share the email again. Someone asked in the chat, so we can do that. Thank you. Lots of great comments, and there's a few contributions on Padlet as well, which is really great to see.
That's amazing. I also wonder, do we receive, is there, when you exit this, do you get a transcript of the chat as well, just so that we have access to like all of it as wonderful?
Yeah, we do. So we'll have that on record. Yes.
Amazing. I just feel like there's some great resource sharing that happened and I don't want to miss it.
Absolutely. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So I'm wondering maybe if we wrap up, since there are about 15 folks in the chat. But yeah, go ahead, Annalisa.
I was actually going to say, I'm wondering if you want to maybe stop the recording and see if
Yeah.
folks feel a little bit more comfortable.
That's a great idea.